Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and we are ready for Penn State to hit the road, head to Arizona, and take on Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl national quarterfinal. Picking up a little bit later in the week, and it's a different game week setup when you have kickoff on a Tuesday night on New Year's Eve. But I hope you all enjoyed your Christmas. We try to do that as best we could here at Lions 24/7. In fact, we're coming to you from 3 different states as we get going with this podcast. Pretty soon, Mark and Daniel will make their trip to the Southwest, get set up down in Arizona for pregame coverage. There's going to be a media day on Sunday down there. A bunch of Penn State opportunities. We'll bring you the latest content at lions247.com. We're going to have a couple more episodes of this podcast before kickoff. The next one will drop on Saturday. That's not normal for us, but check out that one. It's going to be a breakdown of Boise State with a Broncos expert who covers this team on a regular basis. And then we'll come to you early next week when Daniel and Mark have had some time to do some coverage down there, and we get an opportunity to sit down again, rehash some stuff, and get into our predictions for this matchup. But kind of a table setter episode this time around. Mark and Daniel join us. As I said, we often join our Christmases with our families. Appreciate these guys for hopping back on the day after Christmas to kind of catch up and compare some notes. And we are out of a press conference with Andy Kotelnicki, the offensive coordinator for Penn State, a few different players, including Drew Aller. On Friday, there'll be some defensive players and Tom Allen from the coordinator position. So lions247.com remains where you want to be locked into for coverage leading up to kickoff. But Daniel and I sat down in the Beatty River Stadium press box for one final time as currently constructed late Saturday, Mark, to give our thoughts on that first round matchup, a 38-10 victory for the Nittany Lions over the SMU Mustangs. All three of us had the Nittany Lions winning by 10. They were up 28-0 at intermission. Mark, what do you make out of this? We're 5 days removed from it. We've shifted focus largely to the Fiesta Bowl, but round one, definitive win. What did you take away?
We all wish we could be there at the ski lodge with you, Tyler. Are those like antelope horns behind you, or what do we have cooking? That's like a...
I don't ask a lot of questions. My father-in-law has all sorts of stuff out here in his cabin, and this is his little workshop. And I thank him for letting me hop in. I think it's over a jackalope, and I believe it's a mythical creature.
I know what a jackalope is.
Okay,
I'm familiar with those. Listen, going back to the SMU game, I thought that was a huge game for the Penn State defense. They did not play well against Oregon. Arguably, probably not even arguably, it was their worst game of the year. And to bounce back the way they did against a good offense, I think was really important. And remember the way that game started on Penn State's first defensive possession, defensive time on the field. Everything was going wrong. I mean, they were misaligned. They couldn't handle the tempo. They were arguing. Franklin was yelling at Deion Barnes. Deion Barnes was yelling at Keziah Izzard. Izzard was yelling back. I mean, it looked completely out of sorts. And I think that's where the value of a Tom Allen really, really showed. Here's a guy who's been around, steady hand. Penn State never panicked. They get out of that first drive with the quarterback probably making a bad decision where he could have run for a first down. And after that, I mean, that was it. I mean, they settled down and just really took over the game. Obviously, 2 pick sixes and 3 interceptions overall were just gigantic. So after playing a lousy game against Oregon, even though they got better as that game kind of went along, but after not playing well, to come back and reestablish yourself in the first round playoff game, I thought was absolutely huge. And then the other thing that has stood out to me with Andy Kotelnicki, and this has been a theme, you guys have heard me say this, but for people who haven't listened all year, the way that he stays committed to the run, even when things aren't necessarily working well, has just been super impressive to me. I mean, they averaged less than 3 yards per carry in the first quarter of that game, and he never went away from the run. We got a sense when we were down there on the field at the end of the game for how windy it was. When I was doing Brennan Cam, everybody's hats were blowing off. And you saw the difference between the two offenses there. On one hand, you had a quarterback who was making all these risky throws, and they paid the price for it. On the other hand, you had Penn State, where Drew Aller, I think, only threw 3 passes that traveled more than 15 yards. They played it conservative and played it safe, which I think, even though there's all the talk after the game about playing winning football, going for it on that fourth down, generally speaking, I thought they played a very smart game in leaning heavily on the run in that weather, in that wind, in that cold. And ultimately it paid off as Singleton and Katron Allen both ended up having big games. And, once again, we see a game where in the second half, that Penn State running game just dominates. So those two things to me really stood out on offense and defense. And just generally speaking, to take care of business like that, what Penn State did coupled with what Ohio State did, ironically, two of the most criticized coaches of good teams in the Big Ten, I think that really saved face after what for the Big Ten after what Indiana did the night before. I thought that was an embarrassment. I mean, the way that Indiana coached that game, you talk about coaching not to lose. I mean, that was the epitome of it. And for Penn State to come back and do what it did, and then for Ohio State to come back and do what it did, I think that really helped reestablish the Big Ten as the power conference in college football.
Daniel, a big part of our discussion on Saturday was that aggressive nature, and it wasn't pretty with the results early on for Penn State. That they had that opportunity where they elected to go for a 4th and 1, and they didn't get it, and it gave SMU a red zone opportunity, and it felt like you were in firm control, and the Mustangs offense didn't have answers, and you may have given them some life. And we also, at the end of the day, it was a 28-point win. So when we discussed it on the postgame podcast, it was a little bit more of a hindsight than it was in the heat of the moment, because you didn't have to worry about it at the end of the game biting you in the butt. But James Franklin, on a press conference before Christmas early this week, we heard from both him and Boise State's head coach, and he brought up something that we brought up in saying you don't want to feel regret at the end of these games. When you look back at them the night before or the night of, or when you look back at them, months or years down the road, you don't want to feel like you didn't maximize your opportunity that you had in the field. And so to hear that being a kind of guiding star for James Franklin right now and for this Penn State staff and some of their decision-making process, does it change the way you view Penn State and how they're going to handle their playoff opportunities this upcoming week and maybe two more matchups beyond that?
Yeah, I think it was an interesting look into the mentality and the mindset of James Franklin and this team. I think that they realize that they potentially have something special right now in terms of this group of guys playing the type of football they are right now. After I think a lot of that decision in particular, I think I like to think I've been pretty progressive when it comes to being aggressive on 4th down, going for it on 2-point conversions, all of that stuff. Even now, almost a week later, I still think that decision was a little bit more on the reckless side of things at that point, at that place in the field, at that point in the game. Only having a 14-0 lead could have just immediately let SMU back into things right there. But the process now, instead of just looking at the result, of that mindset that James Franklin has, I think it's been pretty illuminating when we talked about after the game, Andy Kotelnicki, playing to win, instead of playing not to lose. Like Mark said, that Indiana game on Friday night, I think was illuminating in some ways into how certain coaches will approach these games. I think that Indiana game, it wasn't even playing not to lose. It was like playing to lose less, which I think in some ways is even worse. And so I think to see Penn State come out and be aggressive and be the bully, be the aggressor. I mean, that's something that, when I do the keys to the game on Friday, that I've written a couple times this year. I think that, Penn State needs to come out. They need to set the terms of engagement. They need to be the bully. They need to land the first punch. Obviously, Oregon did that in the Big Ten championship game. I think that's something that Ohio State and Michigan have been really good at the past couple of years against Michigan or against Penn State, like making Penn State play on their terms. And I think to have Penn State realize that and to go into things, being like, all right, like we don't want any regrets. We want to be the ones who are setting the tone. We want this to happen on our terms. I think that's really positive in terms of where they are, having that kind of confidence, especially at this time of year, because it's win or go home. You have to go in, take care of business. Penn State's been good at that for the most part under James Franklin, and to have that mindset combined with that, I think puts them in a good spot at this point in the year.
Mark, we did hear from Andy Kotelnicki, as I mentioned. We've heard from him a couple times in the last week because of this college football playoff media setup, which we appreciate. And, this 13 months since he was hired and brought to town, and it was a pretty splashy move. And now we're seeing this ground game really start to surface in a significant way down the stretch. There were shades of it during the season, but as we've discussed a lot, whether it was Katron Allen being ineffective, Nick Singleton not being fully healthy, it didn't feel like everyone was on the same page, and you weren't able to put that together. Now, back-to-back postseason matchups in which that wasn't an issue for you. And this is also while you're dealing with the loss of a right tackle and Anthony Donko that the program's really high on. So you combine these things, Nolan Rucci's play in place of Anthony Donko on the right side, and then this ascension of Nick Singleton and Katron Allen and James Franklin earlier this week, referring them, I believe he was asked about that running back duo by a Boise State beat reporter, and he brought up the Thunder and Lightning. And sometimes you could only take that on face value at times this year. It feels like you can truly say it's a Thunder and Lightning type setup with the way they are running the ball right now, the way this offensive line is be able to create some space for them where they're not getting impacted behind the line of scrimmage. So with that said, I know the word of the day last Saturday for Drew Aller was crescendo. Do we feel like this ground game is crescendoing at the right moment for the Nittany Lions?
Yeah, I wonder if that injury to Nick Singleton was a blessing in disguise. I mean, I always say, knock on wood, you never want to see anybody be injured. But here you are at the most important juncture of the season, and he's playing his absolute best football. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that their ground game has really taken off. It's been basically, the same offensive line outside of the main shift that you talked about with Donko being injured and Rucci stepping in. But to have an explosive back, I think, makes it that much more effective. And you sit here and look at the stats, and Nick Singleton has 145 carries. I mean, that is not a lot. 10 carries a game, right? If my math is relatively right. And to be that fresh, I mean, compare that to Ashton Genty with 344 carries. That kid is a beast, and he's unbelievable at what he does. But if you're asking me which back would I want in terms of their usage throughout the season, I take Genty in any game. But in terms of who's going to be fresher at this point, I would have to imagine it's Singleton, right? And I think the explosiveness that Singleton kind of brings to the table, that leads to more success for Katron Allen as that kind of complementary type power back. So the way that they've kept balancing that, I think has been very, very cool. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the ground game has taken off now that he's fully healthy.
Yeah, just some interesting stats here. Nick Singleton, 90 total rushing yards in the 3 games that followed his injury-related absence against UCLA in early October. So 3.2 yards per carry in the next 3 games. Since that, which is a 6-game sample size, he's averaged at least 4.8 yards in every contest. He's averaged at least 6.4 yards in 4 of those 6 contests, including the last couple here in postseason action. And then you tie in what Katron Allen has accomplished recently during the last 3 regular season games to close things out in November. He had 64 combined rushing yards, 2.5 average on carries during that span. 2 postseason matchups, he's got 194 rushing yards. He's averaging 8.1 yards per carry. And Daniel, we've kind of brought this up in a few different ways the last couple of weeks, but as we get set for another matchup and you try to figure out what Penn State can accomplish here in the Fiesta Bowl and perhaps moving forward in the Orange Bowl and maybe even the national championship game, it does make you take a second or third look at what this offense is all about versus what we thought we knew they were about going into the Ohio State game, or even what we thought we knew they were about going out to Indianapolis, because the last 120 minutes of football against teams that had quite a bit of success in stopping the run is very different than maybe in our mind's eye what we anticipated this particular Nittany Lions attack was capable of in the postseason.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the past 3 years when you've had Singleton and Allen, and Penn State has really played at its best when those 2 guys are really rolling. It hasn't really mattered if it's Sean Clifford or Drew Aller back there. When Singleton and Allen are getting theirs, getting into the second level, running over guys, making guys miss, running away from guys, I think that's when we've seen Penn State have its most success. And I think that going into the Oregon game, I really felt like we were in a position where it was like, Drew Aller might have to win these games in the postseason, that they might have to put it on his arm. And, at the end of the game against Oregon, we saw him make, a great touchdown throw in the grasp. And then we also saw him, get it put on his arm at the end and throw an interception. But I think when you look at the big picture, this Penn State offense is really leaning on those running backs. And, you haven't had to worry too much about the wide receiver play. When Tyler Warren has been quiet, you haven't worried about it too much, because Katron Allen and Nick Singleton are making things happen. And I think that when you're running the ball really successfully as Penn State, you're going to win more often than not, because you get to control the tempo, you get to control the terms of engagement on offense. And we know that Nick Singleton can hit home runs. We know that Katron Allen, he might not go for 80, but we've seen him go for 20, 25, even 30. So to have those guys be able to pick up chunks of yardage just gives you an explosive element when you're keeping it on the ground. And I've just been really impressed by this. I think that, whether it's against Boise State or if it's you get past Boise State and it's Notre Dame or Georgia, you might get to a point where Drew Aller is going to have to, strap up and go and lead you down the field in a 2-minute drive. But I think that right now you just feel good about these running backs really controlling things for you on that side of the ball.
The running backs get a lot of attention, but like I'll say, a ton of reinforcement about the success that Nolan Rucci has had at right tackle during the last 3 matchups. And I know we always say, take it for what it's worth, but take it for what it's worth. 3 consecutive games now, Pro Football Focus has decided that he is the top graded offensive lineman from this entire Nittany Lions roster. We heard Venga Ioane today on a Zoom call with us say that he was indeed their top rated offensive lineman when they had their grades in-house. And so that ability to kind of soften the blow of losing Anthony Donko and to put himself in a position where James Franklin has said he's thriving right now, guy who had only started 1 game in his college football career before Donko's injury, a big step for this offense and shows off that depth a little bit. Phil Troutwine has accumulated. Mark, when we look at Drew Aller, of course, he is a guy that nationally people are really laser focused in on to determine what his legacy is going to be at the college level. He's got another year with the Nittany Lions ahead in 2025. Told us that last week. But when you look at this performance, he's not going to be able to get by on, throwing that limited number of passes week in, week out. Not going to be able to give the ball to the running backs and rely on the defense to shut opponents out through the first half each week. What is the next step for Drew Aller as Penn State tries to establish itself as not just a college football playoff contender, but a national championship threat?
Well, just not making mistakes, right? I mean, that's where, a couple interceptions against Oregon, both of those really hurt. I mean, one of them basically gave Oregon a touchdown. So you're looking at a game against a Boise State team that when they went up and played Oregon, lost by 3, I think it was 37-34. The only reason that was a game in the second half was because Oregon fumbled twice and they both led to Boise touchdowns. So taking care of the ball, which Aller has been really good at for most of his career. But there's a balancing act. Last year, what did we see? They took no chances whatsoever until the end of the season, until the change of coordinators. And things just basically didn't work. And then they took some chances very late in the year after the change, and things began to work a little bit better. So I think for Drew Aller, it's just finding that balancing act. I'm anxious to see what it's going to be like for this offense, which seems to be clicking on all cylinders now, playing inside again. You were in those elements, and I think they had to play that game the way that they played it. Again, being relatively conservative, not on that one call in particular, but just in terms of taking care of the football. How are they going to strike that balance now that you're going to be indoors on a fast track? And for Drew Aller, to me, it's that finding that fine balance between taking enough chances but not making the critical mistake. And I know that sounds kind of complicated, but I think he's far enough in his career now that those are the subtleties that are going to elevate him to the next level, as opposed to the basic fundamental stuff that he should have down now.
And Kotelnicki and offensive lineman Venga Ioane both discussed, and Tyler Warren talked about how with Drew Aller having 27 starts under his pocket and a guy who's really been in lockstep with his quarterbacks coach and this offensive coordinator for some time now. It's a pretty seamless approach, getting thrown these opponents, playoff, postseason. Don't have a lot of anticipation on who you're going to face sometimes. And so a lot of confidence in what he's brought to a day-to-day approach before you actually get to the execution stage on game day. And Daniel, when we talk about execution defensively, we'll finish here today before we dive into some transfer portal conversation with Tyler Calvaruso. But Ashton Jeanty is priority number 1A, number 1B. I mean, he's at the top of the list there, however you want to phrase it. And I thought you brought up a really interesting stat. I think you sent it to us in our text thread before we sat down here. As much as we talked about Kaytron Allen, Nick Singleton, and their value to this program, Jeanty has more yards after contact on his 2024 season than Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton have combined altogether. So just trying to put in perspective the value and the way that they have just really rode him to get to 12-1. We'll learn more about Boise State. An episode is going to drop Saturday, breaking down the Broncos with someone who covers that team on a daily basis. But Daniel, you had a story up this week about Jeanty, how James Franklin feels about him. I believe he referred to him as a beast on at least one occasion. And later this week, we'll have a chance to hear from defenders on this challenge. How big of a moment is this for the Penn State defense that has some feathers in its cap? But I believe he's 131 yards shy of becoming the all-time single-season rushing leader in college football history. And he obviously has his sights on getting his Broncos to the semifinal round.
Yeah, James Franklin was really complimentary of Ashton Jeanty when we talked to him on Monday, I believe. He said that any other year, Ashton Jeanty probably wins the Heisman. And he said that Jeanty probably had a really good case to win it this year. He was number 2 on my ballot, behind Hunter, so I agreed with that. And then Franklin said that the offense starts and ends with Jeanty, and it also revolves around Jeanty. So I think that when you put all that together, I think that he gave some credit to the quarterback Maddox Madsen and compared him to Garrett Green of West Virginia. But it's just clear that the focus is on Jeanty and how Boise State uses him to set things up in the play action, everything that goes along with that. But he's going to be a challenge. I mean, according to Pro Football Focus, it's 1,889 yards after contact. He has almost 2,500 yards this season by himself. That number of yards after contact, I think would rank in, that total alone would rank in the top 5 or top 10 overall this season in rushing yards. Singleton and Allen have combined for 1,820 yards overall. So it's definitely a kind of a different beast, if you will. And I think that this is where you put those Penn State linebackers in the spotlight, and especially the interior of the defensive line. We've talked about that defensive tackle group getting thinned out a little bit by injuries and Hakeem Beamon leaving. Well, this is a team that is going to try to run it down your throat when you're up against them. So those guys are going to have to be ready. I think it's very key that we saw Tony Rojas play with confidence, have one of his better games this season just a week ago, because you look at Kobe King, Dom DeLuca, Tony Rojas, they're going to get some work there at the second level. There's going to be opportunities for them to clean up. You think about Jalen Reed, what we've seen him do when he's been playing in the box. I really do think that this is going to take a total team effort to contain Jeanty. I wrote a little bit about it in my prediction this morning, but he's going to get his. That's just how it works. You look at his season statistics, what he's been able to do against everyone on their schedule. If you're Penn State, it's just limiting it. When does he get his? Where on the field does he get his? And keeping him out of the end zone. But he's got 29 rushing touchdowns this year. No one's really been able to do that either. So it's going to be a really fun challenge. And I'm really interested on Friday to hear what Tom Allen has to say about what's ahead of them.
He's got 6 games with 200 plus rushing yards out of their 13 matchups on the season. And his lowest output from a rushing yardage perspective was 127 against Portland State. And that was a game where they did not need him for much of that run, and they got him to the sideline pretty quick. We'll have a lot of coverage as this matchup starts to become more and more clear. As I said, offensive input from Kotelnicki and some players on this Thursday. We'll do the same for the defensive side of the ball on Friday. Coverage at Lions247.com. Much more coming throughout the weekend. Looking ahead to this matchup, and there'll be a media day down in Arizona on Sunday. Guys, pack your shorts, your T-shirts, your polo shirts. Leave some of those sweatshirts behind. Look forward to your coverage and catch up with you again soon here on the podcast as we give our predictions and players to watch a little closer to kickoff.
Hey, one quick note, Tyler.
Yeah.
I don't really care. Cal Varuso could wait. After the game, I don't know if you guys were there. After the first round game against SMU, Devon J. Thomas was up at the front table, and he wrapped up and he stood up and he started talking to reporters, and he was asking if Brashard Smith got whatever yardage he needed for some sort of record. I don't even remember what it was. Was it like total yards in a season or something? And we didn't seem to know, but he was very cognizant that Brashard Smith had some sort of record within reach. Now, I can guarantee you tomorrow that none of the Penn State defensive players are going to mention a word about trying to prevent Genty from getting a record. But you better believe in their meeting rooms and whatnot that they don't want that to go down on their watch. So it's going to be fun to watch that. He is a great, great player. And I think the Penn State defense reestablished itself as a great defense. And as Daniel mentioned, it's going to be fun. But you better believe that those defenders are going to be motivated by not letting him get some career record or some single season record against them.
Yeah, Brashard Smith, a lot of accolades during his season with SMU, kind of a dual threat out of the backfield. They did a nice job in silencing him and Kevin Jennings at quarterback. And even when you take out the sacks that they got, only permitted 2.8 yards per rush attempt against SMU last Saturday. On the season, in the second half overall through 14 games, 2.6 yards per carry after halftime. So we'll see if they can come up with a combination that leads to issues for Boise State, but a lot of teams have tried and failed to do that. Mark, Daniel, appreciate it. Happy holidays to you both, and get down to Arizona safely.
Thanks, Tyler.
Yep.
All right, let's turn our attention to Tyler Calvaruso, who is kind enough to wait out Mark's commentary there. And Tyler, welcome back in. It is another playoff matchup week, so we naturally are going to be geared toward that coverage. But as we always say, recruiting never stops, and this time of year, transfer portal information never stops, and that's what we're going to dive into with you. Appreciate you for coming on board with us, and hope you and yours had a Merry Christmas.
Very blessed that I have the floor now after waiting out Mark. But yeah, no, man, it's glad to be back on. You know, last week was rough for me dealing with some sickness, but I'm back now, and you know, season's still rolling on, portal's rolling on, so we've got a bunch to talk about.
Yeah, last time we had you on, we were talking about Kyron Hudson, the pickup from USC, a wide receiver who actually caught a touchdown against the Nittany Lions in October. We broke down that edition. Since then, over at Lions247.com, we've had some good USC feedback, commentary from Los Angeles on what he did during his time with the Trojans and what he might be able to do carrying that over here to State College. But since we last had you on, Tyler, a couple more pickups out of the transfer portal for Penn State in their 2025 class, one of which actually occurred before we got to the kickoff of playoff action for Penn State. I know you were all over it with coverage at Lions247.com along with Brian Doan, but let's bring the conversation here to the podcast, work our way back in time a little bit to that December 20th pickup last Friday from Nittany White. Texas A&M was his home for the last couple of years, but when he left the high school level, he was considered one of the premier players in the 2022 class out of the state of Pennsylvania. He's from Imhotep in Philadelphia. That's a program that's been good to Penn State. It's been a bit of a pipeline here in state. And when it comes to Nittany White, he's a top 100 overall player, top 50, in fact, when he made his move to the SEC out of high school. Remains relatively unfulfilled, I would say, Mr. Calvaruso, in terms of that development. There's a ways to go. The production reflects that from his time as an Aggie, but he's circling back and kind of like we've seen with guys like Nolan Rucci and Julian Fleming, priority targets in the state of Pennsylvania who decided to go elsewhere and have come back. And the difference here is while you got Fleming for 1 year and you got Rucci for a couple, Nittany White, I guess more like Rucci, hasn't really had a chance to show what he can do at the power conference level on film. And so you're still getting a player who, yes, there's some experience in play here, but it's also what can we accomplish with him under our roof within our facility that maybe wasn't getting done elsewhere.
Yeah, a little bit of experience combined with some, I still believe to be some untapped potential lingering with Nittany White. It didn't really go his way at A&M. His freshman year was really the year in which he made the most impact. He played the most. Then the injury bug crept up and bit him. And from that point on, he dealt with that knee injury, and it hindered his development. It kept him off the field. And, Penn State, it has the utmost confidence in the developmental ability of Deion Barnes. That played a big part in this one coming together. I touched on it before White committed. Barnes trained him when he was a prep player growing up in Philly. So those two, they have those roots. If there's anyone who knows Nittany White and what he can be as a pass rusher, it's Deion Barnes. If there's anyone who knows what makes Nittany White tick, what could help get him to the next level, I believe it to be Deion Barnes at this point. So returning home, returning to a familiar place in the sense that not that you don't just have your position coach that you're familiar with, you're a bunch of former Imatep players on the roster, guys that Nittany White has kept up with over the years. So he's going to be walking into the facility, seeing some familiar faces. So I think that it's a solid portal get on a couple different fronts. One, you're bringing in a 6'5", 245-pound edge rusher who still has room to develop and has multiple years of eligibility still on his plate. And Penn State, that body type alone, if you could get him coached up, get him to where he needs to be, he can be an impact. And, of course, if he stays healthy as well, we have to note that as well with White, given the way things played out for him at A&M. There could really be something there. And Penn State's going to stay in the market for an edge rusher, maybe a little bit more decorated and established moving forward because, again, you always want to build quality, depth, experience. That will all help you moving forward. But there's a lot to like with White still, I believe. And most of that has to do with his untapped potential that still, I believe, is lingering.
He played, I think it was about a dozen combined games first couple of years on campus,
Yeah.
a couple sacks. You look at what the injury did to his third year at the college level. He only played 9 total defensive snaps. He checked in for a little bit of work against, I think, Missouri and New Mexico State over the course of this 2024 campaign. Is there anything you can kind of bring to light for us in terms of his health standpoint, the medical angle here, and ultimately what Penn State sees and him being a guy who in year 4 at the college level can be more than just a reserve?
And contrary to what you might see on social media from some people, you can't work these kids out during their transfer portal official visits, but you can get access to medical records. And I could tell you with, pretty confidence that, Penn State's never going to move on a guy if they're not thrilled with the medicals, if they don't think he can hold up physically, especially in the Big Ten, given the physical demands of the conference. So everything checked out with Nittany White on that front. And, again, he lost time in his development due to that injury. But the thought is it's not something that's going to linger and lead that into becoming an ongoing problem during his Penn State career. The hope is that's in the past. That's a Texas A&M thing. Now he's in State College, fresh start, medicals checked out. Penn State's going to look to get rolling with White when he arrives on campus in January. And, really just hope for the best. Hope he could stay on the field and hope that his development could take off under Barnes' watch.
When you look at White, and you talked about this before, this doesn't end the conversation maybe in terms of looking for options off the edge. We know Abdul Carter has got eligibility left, but we also know he may be the top defensive player on NFL draft boards across the league come next spring. Denied Dennis Sutton is a guy who's flashed in moments. We've seen some of that validation of his 5-star history, but you wonder if he may want to have an opportunity to put together another more extensive campaign at the college level. Meanwhile, Smith Vilbert's a year 6 player. Vanover's a year 5 player. We haven't seen a ton of Max Granville, the freshman. Same with freshman Jalen Harvey. Just not a lot of known commodities, I guess, is that where I'm getting at when you look toward 2025 and you kind of work your way past the current starting lineup and factor in veterans could be moving on. And so Arnold Ebiketie comes to mind as someone who came to campus out of the portal and was a big-time impact player, ended up being a second-round pick. Chop Robinson, of course, came to campus, made an impact right away. A couple years later, he's gone as a number 1 round pick. So when you look at maybe someone a little more established, someone who maybe can point to more on their college resume, is that something that remains a priority for Penn State? or would you say there's other bigger fish to fry, and you can only do so much in terms of your investment financially and otherwise in the transfer portal?
It's definitely still on the radar. But when you look at the other positionals, D tackle, they're still very much in the market for an impact guy on the interior. And that market, and even the edge rusher market, really, it's not the best, to be completely honest with you. It's not really maybe as loaded as some people originally anticipated. There's definitely some good players out there, no doubt about it, guys that could help you. But guys who really, really move the needle, I think that's lacking in the portal a little bit right now. But Penn State's going to continue to stay vigilant, especially at D tackle, man, because they want to add on the interior. Bear Alexander wound up committing to Oregon. David Blay wound up committing to Miami during Penn State's playoff win over SMU at that. And Penn State was really competitive in that recruitment. It was a recruitment that, NIL was very much a factor, and Penn State was competitive in it until the end. Miami was able to come over the top, come out with the win in that recruitment. But Penn State, they're going to stay vigilant on the interior at D tackle. Edge remains a position they're looking at. Receivers, we'll get into in a little bit. If the fit's right, they'll look to make a move there. But we're at the point where you're not just going to take a guy in the portal, just take a guy in the portal. You want to make sure it's the right guy coming out of the portal from an on and off field perspective. Linebacker, safety, running back, O-line, all positions that remain in the mix on the radar and continue to come up in conversation when it comes to what Penn State is looking to accomplish in the portal.
We fully anticipated that receiver would be a spot firmly on that radar, and that has proven to be the case through the actions of this Penn State staff. Multiple commitments now picked up. Earlier last week, Kyron Hudson, after 4 years with USC, going to be finishing out his career with Penn State, as we broke down on here on the podcast. And then the second name at receiver, making the move from the Sun Belt, where he was an all first-team conference pick at Troy this season, Devontae Ross. And people are going to say, well, what does it look like making that jump, from Group of Five to the Power Four level? Well, you look at the sample size against the Big Ten opponent this past season, Iowa, 3 touchdowns from 60-plus yards. He has a 62-yard and a 63-yard touchdown reception during a 140-yard effort through the air. He also returns a punt 77 yards for a touchdown against the Hawkeyes. Legitimate threat in multiple phases in the Sun Belt competition for this Troy squad. And over the course of the season, 76 catches, 1,043 yards, 11 touchdown catches on the year. A lot of people would love for this to be Tez Johnson 2.0. We all got a close look at Tez Johnson a couple weeks ago. He's Oregon's primary receiver. He's also somebody who launched their college career at Troy, made noise at that level, then moved up and has done really good things for Oregon. So make the case for us and for our listeners out there who would love to see an impact pickup and a guy who makes the jump and makes it look good for this particular pickup. Tyler, what do you like about Ross, and what are the signs of optimism that just because he's going from the Sun Belt to the Big Ten, he's not going to lose that win from his sales?
Well, it starts with his speed. His speed's legit. He can get loose underneath. He can take the top off of defense. He's not the biggest guy in the world. He's around 5'11", 160, which when doing this evaluation was one of the things that stood out as one of those question marks. But not everyone has to be running around like DK Metcalf at wide receiver to be productive. You could be a guy of a slighter frame and be productive, and Ross falls in to that category. And his speed has pretty much everything to do with it. He's electric. You saw it in the Iowa game earlier this fall, and he can be back in Kinnick next year now that he's committed to Penn State. But he can win on the outside. He's going to be a slot guy for Penn State. It looks like that's where he's going to be in the Big Ten. I think that's probably the best spot for him. But his speed makes him a legitimate weapon, and that's from what I've been able to gather where a lot of the internal excitement comes from. Because Penn State, I say it every time we talk about receiver in the portal, they want to get more explosive. They want to get more dynamic. Devontae Ross, when they're checking off those boxes in their portal evaluations, he checks them. And the tape at Troy is impressive. The Sun Belt's a solid G5 conference. You're not playing, scraps on a weekly basis. You're playing some solid comp. And Devontae Ross is one of the best wideouts in that conference. So, yeah, if you're a Penn State fan, obviously you're hoping it's Tez Johnson 2.0. That'd be a hell of an outcome for Penn State. But I think Ross has a skill set that He might not be dominant necessarily, but he can help your passing attack at the Power 5 level. And I think Penn State fans, well, at least the hope is that they're going to get to see that next season. I think Ross has it in him. I really do. I was excited about this one from an evaluation standpoint and talking to people and what they like about Devontae Ross. I think it translates to the Big Ten and Penn State's passing attack.
We've seen mixed results, guys making that jump up in competition. A few years ago, Mitchell Tinsley comes to campus. He's a starter all the way for the Nittany Lions, an important part of that offensive plan on the way to a Rose Bowl victory. And then, you end up with Dante Cephas last year, who had a 2,000 yards combined about in the last 2 years of his Kent State career, is not able to find staying power within the Penn State receiver plan. Ultimately, that fizzles out by the end of the year, and he's moved on. So we'll keep tabs on what is going to happen with these guys' development between Hudson and Ross when they get to campus. But are we closing the door on possible other wide receiver pickups? I don't think any of us believes the wide receiver exit door is going to go unused from players who are currently on this roster. Whenever the season ends, guys make portal decisions. I think there's going to be some movement. Do we believe that more than 2 transfer additions are in play for Penn State?
Yeah, and it comes back to fit. No stone, I think, especially at wide receiver in the portal, is going to be left unturned. I think Penn State is going to explore any avenue that it has to get better at that position. Casey Concepcion from NC State, Penn State fans should be familiar with him. Penn State was a finalist in his high school recruitment. He had a really good first year at NC State, tailed off a little bit this past season, but was still a really impactful player in that offense. He's continued to listen. It'll come down to getting him to campus for a visit to determine what Penn State's chances really are there. And, of course, right now you can't make visits, so that would have to occur beginning January 1st through the 5th. There's a little bit of a window for transfers to get out and make visits. So we'll see if anything comes about with Concepcion. But Malachi Fields is a name we discussed. He's off to Notre Dame. That looked like a good fit for Penn State, given the relationship with Marcus Hagans. Hagans recruited him to Virginia, coached him for a little bit there. But some guys, they hit the portal. They have their sights set elsewhere. Fields had his set on Notre Dame. He's committed to the Fighting Irish now. So that is not an option for Penn State. But they'll continue to examine, 1, the names out there, 2, the guys who hit the market. Not just now, but that post-playoff window, the 5-day window, maybe some guys who are on playoff teams hit the portal that generate a little bit of intrigue. And this is a conversation that we'll probably be carrying into the spring, depending on what they do at wide receiver from here on out. Again, if an intriguing talent presents itself, a guy who can help Penn State's offense presents itself, they'll explore it. They'll see if it works for them. But as things are right now, there's a lot to like from the internal perspective about the additions of Hudson and Ross. There's some excitement there for sure.
Before we say goodbye, and just so people are fully aware, Lions247.com has your latest coverage on the transfer portal from Tyler and other members of our network team who keep their finger on the pulse of this thing on a minute-by-minute basis. That will continue through the weekend. That will continue through the month of December. And 50% off deal still going right now for this month of December. We're starting to get to the final few days of this month, but it's out there. Just wanted to make sure everyone's aware of that. And in terms of looking ahead, looking forward, Tyler, we talked about the commitment pickups and some of these impacts on potential transfer class at these different positions. Where else do you see Penn State prioritizing on the field right now before we part ways on this episode?
I look at linebacker. Linebacker's been tough in the sense that Kendall Daniels is the lone player at the position who's made it to campus for a visit from Oklahoma State. But it's been really, really, really quiet in terms of intel on him. I checked in again this morning, and it's still really quiet. So I can't really pinpoint where exactly that one's heading. I know Penn State felt good about its pitch to Daniels while he was on campus, but beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. So we'll see. He's playing that one really, really close to the vest. Safety, like I mentioned, Jeremiah Johnson from Georgia State is a name that has popped up in conversation. Running back, if there's a right fit. And you took care of this one for us late last week, TJ Shanahan, Texas A&M offensive line transfer has an interest in visiting Penn State. We're going to see if that one comes together. But Phil Trautman, they hosted Teague Anderson from Utah State. He went off to NC State, where the path to playing time, I think, is a little bit more clear. Penn State's always going to be in the market for warm bodies in the trenches, so we'll see what comes about on that front. But if there's one name to watch on the O-line right now, it's probably TJ Shanahan.
All right, Tyler, we appreciate the perspective. We're so invested in covering this current Penn State team.
You guys are killing
but
it,
you
man.
can't look beyond what we already got brewing for 2025 because it's right here in front of our faces. In the next couple of weeks alone, you will have guys, whenever they lose or whenever they win the championship, you'll have a huge chunk of this roster bidding farewell, getting stuff out of their apartments and houses and moving on with their lives. And then huge wave of freshmen, this wave of transfers. And when we get back on the field with this team for spring ball in March, a big chunk of the team will look very different regardless of what they accomplish in the coming weeks. That is life in college football. And Tyler, you do a great job making sure we always know what the future may hold for these Nittany Lions. Thanks so much for your coverage and for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me, man. You guys keep doing your thing. It's been fun to follow along everything you guys have been putting out. So,
all right, the path to a New Year's Eve kickoff against Boise State continues for the Nittany Lions. They will be relocating to Arizona along with a big portion of our Lions 24/7 staff, as promised. We'll have another episode of this podcast over the weekend. Look for this one dropping on Saturday that breaks down Boise State from the perspective of a Broncos reporter who's been following this team for several years. And we'll be back with another episode early next week to get you fully ready for kickoff. What we're hearing from the Nittany Lions down in Arizona, the most notable storylines as this program tries to punch its ticket to the national semifinal round, and ultimately our predictions for the final score between the Nittany Lions and the Broncos of Boise State. For now, stepping aside, big thanks to Mark, Daniel, and Tyler. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.